So essentially we've upgraded our mainstream UK house price forecast from when we last reforecast in November of 2023. The reasons for that are primarily a stronger than expected start to the year of 2024, and that's partly down to lower mortgage rates. So lenders have actually been much more competitive with rates than we were perhaps expecting. We've also seen really strong indicators from a lot of the kind of lead indicators in terms of what demand is likely to be like in the coming months. So that's also led to us increasing our forecast from a marginal fall, which we were previously expecting, up to growth of 2.5% across the UK as a whole this year now.
حسنتم أيضا توقعاتكم المستقبلية ل5 سنوات قادمة وبشكل كبير، فلماذا هذا التفاؤل وما الأسباب وراء تغيير هذه الرؤية؟
Yeah, so over the 5 years, we're expecting that the UK will see average growth of just over 21%. The reasons for increasing that 5-year number is partly down to an improved economic outlook, so particularly in the latter part of our forecast period, so throughout kind of 2026 and further on. That's when we're expecting that the economy will perform more strongly. That will give buyers much more confidence in terms of their finances, and of course that will give them a bit more buying power, which will lead to kind of those stronger levels of house price growth. And that coupled with the kind of regular cuts in the bank base rate that we're expecting means that then that will open up more affordability and leading to those stronger levels of growth.
فإذا هذه الأرقام المتفائلة بشأن السوق البريطاني بشكل عام، ولكن ماذا عن توقعاتكم بشأن سوق العقارات السكنية في لندن تحديداً، وأيضاً السوق الفاخر أو البرايم داخل وسط لندن؟
Across the mainstream London markets, we're expecting that it will perform relatively in line with the UK, just given where we've seen prices increase so far this year. But actually over the 5-year period, it's expected to be weaker with growth of around 14%. And that's just because affordability is the main constraint within London. So house prices and house price to income ratios are much higher across the capital. And that means that where we've seen those higher mortgage rates, it's likely to have more of an impact on the markets where we have higher values. And actually, interestingly, where we're now not expecting to see the price falls this year, that kind of has a bigger impact in London where we're not seeing that slight price correction. Affordability continues to be more constrained over the 5-year period overall. So we're expecting growth of around 14% across mainstream London. If we then think about central London in particular, the prime markets, they're affected by very different kind of drivers, so much less impact directly from interest rates, and it's much more impacted by kind of sentiment and the global wealth generation, as well as interest from international buyers. So where we've seen the market outperform since the mini budget in September of 2022, which is when we've begun to see interest rates increase, actually over this year it's likely that we won't see any growth across central London in particular, just because we'll have slightly more uncertainty surrounding the general election. The market tends to be much more discretionary, and so if people might adopt a bit of a wait and see approach. We've also had the proposed changes to non-dom status, which is also likely to just add a bit more caution to that top end of the market as well.
وماذا عن التغيرات الضريبية المعلن عنها مؤخراً التي سترفع الضرائب على الأجانب الغير مقيمين في بريطانيا؟ التغيرات في هذه الضريبة التابعة للنون دومز إلى أي مدى من الممكن أن تؤثر على طلب الأجانب؟
So firstly on the non-doms, so I think in the short term what we've seen is, some uncertainty. Some people are slightly more cautious now as they just kind of reassess what their new tax situation is. And of course they need to weigh up what that new tax situation looks like compared to, their personal preferences and actually where they want to live. So what we're seeing is perhaps a slight slowdown in activity just as people kind of take some advice on their new tax situation. But in the long term, we don't expect, that there will necessarily be a huge exodus of non-doms from London or from the UK. But it's just likely that we will see slightly lower levels of demand over the longer term from that type of buyer.
وبالنسبة لطلب الأجانب بشكل عام على العقارات في بريطانيا وفي لندن، كيف تقيمين طلب الأجانب في الوقت الراهن ومن أي المناطق الجغرافية ترون هذا الطلب؟
So generally we see about half of buyers across central London coming from overseas, and then the other half are just domestic buyers. At the top end of the market, so say above 5 million or 10 million pounds, that proportion will be slightly higher. more buyers from international areas. We're seeing quite a mixture at the moment, depending on different, coming from different countries. So we are seeing demand coming from the Middle East, particularly that fluctuates depending on oil prices. We're also seeing a lot of demand from those who are denominated in US dollars, given the currency advantage that's still on offer and has been on offer for a considerable period now since the UK voted to leave the EU in 2016. And so it is quite a mixture coming from different nationalities.
وماذا عن سياسات بنك إنجلترا التي من الممكن أن نرى من خلالها خفض الفائدة أو من الممكن أن نرى تأخير في موعد خفض الفائدة هنا في بريطانيا؟ إلى أي مدى تشكل السياسة النقدية عامل خطورة قد يؤثر على الأسعار أو حتى على رؤيتكم الإيجابية؟
So across the whole mainstream markets, of course, if rates stay higher for longer, then that will have an impact on our forecast. But I think what's important in terms of the shape of that forecast is most of that growth that we've forecast is anticipated in the first half of the year. And then we are expecting more of a slowdown in the second half of the year already, partly because of the potential for some uncertainty surrounding the general election, which is likely to come later in the year. And also if we do see, as you suggest, if we do see those rate cuts coming slightly later, then that's likely to just put added pressure on people's affordability, and that will mean that prices increase more slowly. But in a sense, we've already kind of factored in the fact that we think the first half of this year will be stronger than the second.
وإذا نظرنا إلى سوق لندن بشكل خاص، أي المناطق وأي الأحياء ترون فيها الفرص الأكبر؟
Yeah, so some of the outer boroughs, as you say, probably have more potential for stronger levels of growth over the longer period, just because they are less constrained by those affordability pressures that I touched on earlier. In terms of sort of the upper end, I'd say sort of central London markets where they haven't necessarily recovered as strongly since the COVID-19 pandemic, so places such as Mayfair, where we saw values fall quite significantly and they perhaps haven't increased more, whereas the likes of Notting Hill, Kensington and so on actually saw relatively strong levels of growth during that period just because of the types of housing stock that was on offer. I think it's also important to think about different property types, so it's kind of been well documented that houses have outperformed flats for quite a significant period now, and so there is the potential for more growth to come forward in those flats in the near future.
إذن كيف يمكن أن نصف السوق العقاري اليوم؟ هل هو معروف ب-buyer's market أو سوق المشترين؟
Yeah, different segments characterised differently, I'd say. I think at the moment we're still at the point where buyers and sellers' expectations aren't aligned, and that's kind of having a bit of an impact in terms of sellers are still expecting a bit more for their property after the growth that they've seen over the last 3 or 4 years, whereas buyers have had to really readjust their budgets in terms of what they're able to afford, and so it does really vary depending on property types and so on.
وبالنسبة لأسعار العقارات المعروضة للبيع، هل ترون أن العقارات تباع فعلياً عندما تبرم الصفقة بالسعر المطلوب للبيع أم بأقل من هذا السعر؟ وهل يختلف الأمر في المناطق أو الأحياء المختلفة؟
It really depends on the situation, and actually some family houses in the likes of southwest London, so say Fulham, Wandsworth, places like that, actually are still selling for really competitive prices, and in some cases selling for prices that were being achieved in 2021, 2022 when we were at the height of the race for space pandemic. So certain property types where there's very little stock available are still going for those very strong prices.